Welcome. Welcome all. We'll be getting started shortly. We'll be going on Facebook Live shortly. We're so excited to have so many of you for this session today. Welcome again. Thank you for joining us. And I believe very soon we'll be on Facebook Live. I trust that the powers that be are in charge of that. I'm going to go ahead and, as folks are arriving, slowly get us started in a minute or two. I do want to give folks a chance to hop on because I know we had a high registration for this session. Great. Looks like we're streaming this live on Facebook as well. Really excited about this session in partnership with the National Immigrant Integration Conference. Welcome, welcome. Just looking at the clock, I'm going to go ahead and begin our session today. I know that folks will continue arriving and joining us throughout this hour, and I'm really glad that we have such a great registration total with the National Immigrant Integration Conference. We will be reserving some time for Q&A. There is a Q&A button in the Zoom that you all can use to post your questions if you'd like to. But let's go ahead and get started. So welcome everybody. My name is Sheila Babbitt. I am Senior Program Officer with the Rise Together Fund. Rise Together Fund is a national donor collaborative housed at the Proteus Fund. We were founded in 2008 in response to ongoing Islamophobic backlash and policy targeting Black, African, Arab, Middle Eastern, Muslim, and South Asian communities, those who have been lumped together under post-9/11 national security architecture and the war on terror. Rise Together Fund provides approximately $2 million in grants per year to grassroots organizations like those you're going to hear from in today's session. We've spent the last 13 years designing responsive grant making, technical assistance, and programming efforts to support communities that have been targeted in post-9/11 climate. We're holding this session this year in partnership with NIC because we see the harm caused by post-9/11 policy on so many communities of color. Just to paint the picture a little bit, I'm going to draw from a terrific report authored by Project South, another one of our Rise Together Fund grantees. Their report is called Spying on the Margins, the History, Law, and Practice of U.S. Surveillance Against Muslim, Black, and Immigrant Communities. As Project South writes, the political crisis the 9/11 attacks triggered opened the door to significantly greater surveillance and counterterrorism authority by federal government. These power grabs ultimately shaped the legal and political situation that Muslim, Black, Arab, and immigrant communities currently face. President George W. Bush declared a global war on terrorism within hours of the 9/11 attacks. Bush argued that it would be a new kind of war fought on different battlefields that would take place until every terrorist group of global reach has been found, stopped, and defeated. That again is quoting the report from Project South, Spying on the Margins. So what did this war on terror mean in practice? Some of the post-9/11 policies and trends that emerged included the creation of immigration and customs enforcement, and we're seeing the harm of this agency today on so many communities of color, including the recent forced sterilizations at an ICE detention center in Georgia. The US government also implemented the National Security Entry-Exit Registration System, or NSEERS, which required non-citizen men and boys from 26 countries, 25 of which were Muslim majority countries, to be separately documented, photographed, and fingerprinted. And these policies and the sentiments behind them informed the more recent Muslim and Africa bans of the Trump administration, which resulted in deeply traumatizing separation of families globally. So the post 9/11 climate really ushered in an expansion of the US's already troubling policies toward immigrant communities and all communities of color in the United States. Given all of this, I'm really proud to hold this session with 3 of our grantees who have been doing the hard work of both addressing harms of post 9/11 policy and simultaneously building power and a new future, a truly multiracial democracy. So now I'm proud to introduce our speakers. We have with us today Sushma Raghavan, Deputy Director of Unite Oregon. Sushma is the daughter of immigrants from South Asia who was raised in the Bay Area and moved to Portland in 2012. In 2018, Sushma joined Unite Oregon as the field director to build power with immigrants and communities of color following the spike in hate crimes and white nationalism. We also have with us Homaira Yusufi, Deputy Director of Partnership for the Advancement of New Americans, an organization that fights to advance the full economic and civic inclusion of refugee communities. She leads a team of organizers and advocates with a community-driven approach to advance policies that directly impact refugee communities. With the current crisis in Afghanistan, she is partaking in significant national, state, and local advocacy to support the resettlement of Afghan community members. And we have with us today Amaha Kasa, Executive Director of African Communities Together, a national membership organization of African immigrants and their families, which he founded in 2012. Amaha has worked as a labor and community organizer for 25 years. He is a licensed attorney and he is an immigrant from Ethiopia. So we're so thrilled to have our panelists with us today. And Sushma, I'm going to begin with you. Unite Oregon was founded post 9/11. So could you please tell us the story about the founding of your organization? What was it seeking to achieve at the time? And how has Unite Oregon's work continued to be responsive to the post 9/11 climate?
Hi, Sheila. Thank you so much. And thanks for having me today and welcome everybody in attendance. As Sheila said, my name is Sushma. I am the Deputy Director of Unite Oregon. Our mission at Unite Oregon is to work across the state to build a unified intercultural movement for justice. And one of our predecessor organizations, the Center for Intercultural Organizing, was founded by Portland area immigrants, refugees, and Muslims who gathered to resist the post 9/11 wave of Islamophobia and anti-immigrant discrimination. Our founder, who is now a state senator, Senator Casey Jama, and a former Somali refugee, organized with a number of other immigrants, organized a march and a protest outside of the federal building in downtown Portland to protest the unjust arrest of the imam of the Portland area's largest mosque and a really well-known Muslim community leader who the FBI had been surveilling and targeted. Since then, we have continued organizing against the targeting of the BAMEMSA communities in the aftermath of 9/11, but we've also broadened our focus towards building power for immigrant and refugee communities more broadly. And this model, which is a multiracial organizing model, came about because we were witnessing that the same institutions that profiled and detained and discriminated against our communities, the BAMEMSA communities, were really the same ones that have spied on Black organizers and separated immigrant families. To give you some context about the state that we're organizing in here in Oregon, Portland is the whitest major city in the country. And there is really a large, long history of Oregon of organized white nationalist groups. So really what we have found in the last 20 years, in order to succeed in this environment, we have found that creating and growing multiracial organizing spaces is really what we have had to do to continue to push for racial justice. And a little bit more background about Unite Oregon. Today we have 4 chapters across the state. We focused on the following issues: immigrant refugee justice, climate justice, policing, housing, health equity, community development, and education. As we do that through community organizing, policy advocacy, leadership development, and civic engagement, and our new service to organizing model, which is our direct service program, where we connect people that we provide direct services to our organizing and leadership opportunities, so that the people that are most impacted by the policies are directly informing the policies that we're trying to change. So now I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the campaigns that we've taken on in response to the post-9/11 climate that we're organizing in. As an organization, our first major policy win resulted from our End Profiling campaign. In 2006, our founder was pulled over and profiled during a police traffic stop. And we used that incident as a catalyst for a campaign to ban police profiling. It finally passed in the state in 2015. And as part of that bill, the Attorney General established a task force to work on implementation. Of course, we were a member of the task force and a leader on the issue, and we went back in the next legislative session to pass 2 changes to the law that have really been pivotal to the success of this profiling ban, which is 1, collecting data on police stops, and 2, empowering the Attorney General to examine the data for patterns of profiling and push for investigations of local law enforcement. Our policing work really grew out of this campaign, and we've continued to work on policing reform. Currently, we are working on defunding the Portland Police Bureau. In the summer of 2020, we partnered with another local organization on a campaign to cut the Portland Police Bureau budget. We were able to generate 38,000 emails from community members, hundreds of phone calls, hundreds of in-person testimony to the city council. They all echoed our demands. And that campaign resulted in 2020 a total of a $15 million cut from the police budget. So that is a campaign that's ongoing, and we're continuing to work on not only divesting from the police, but reimagining what community safety can look like for our communities. We're also the lead convener of the Police Accountability Network in Portland, which is a network of about 75 community, faith, and labor groups. And we are working on centering the needs of the grassroots community during the current police union contract negotiations in Portland. But going back to profiling, we can't talk about profiling in post-9/11 America without talking about Joint Terrorism Task Forces, or JTTFs. So these are FBI teams that work with local law enforcement. They're supposedly investigating potential terror threats, but really in practice, what they've been used for is to surveil and harass Muslims, Black activists, and immigrants. And ICE is really their largest partner nationally. So in 2005, Portland became the first city in the entire country to withdraw from participation with our local JTTF. And that was a result of a campaign and a coalition that we were a part of. And so Portland, we've actually gone back and forth. In 2015, there was a political change in the city council and they rejoined, but we kept organizing with our coalition. And in 2019, we were able to win our campaign and the city withdrew again. And this campaign is really an example of how we're able to plug our leadership cohort members into our issue and organizing campaigns. One of our cohort participants got involved in organizing to end this partnership in 2019. She was participating in our workshops, which we typically do, like advocacy training, testimony training, and our popular education model and our approach really made her realize that her story is important. She testified in front of the city council during this campaign to tell the story of how, after surveillance, the FBI stormed her Portland home when she was 10 years old. They've arrested her father, and she and her siblings were detained temporarily. And her father was never charged for anything, but he was detained for 2 years, which really, you know, it has been a very traumatic thing for her family, and that trauma continues today. Her family's fear is so profound that when she was assaulted as a teenager, they asked her not to report the assault to the police because of their fear of once again being scapegoated. So that's really an example of we're trying to use the power of people's stories to change the policies and to illustrate how these policies impact everyday people like us. We're also active in refugee organizing. I think Amaha here is going to talk more about the Muslim in Africa bans, so I won't get into a lot of detail around those, but one of the results of those bans, coupled with Trump's cut in refugee arrivals in the United States, caused refugee services funding all across the country to be cut, and really left newly arrived refugees without a safety net because their local refugee resettlement offices were closing due to lack of funds. So we joined with our local resettlement agencies in Oregon to win state funding for these services for the first time ever in 2019. So Oregon became the third state in the country to win, to fund their resettlement services. And we continue to work on refugee advocacy. We worked in the most recent state legislative session to establish the Office of Immigrant Refugee Advancement, and we're currently working on the implementation of that. So those are some examples of how we've taken on some community campaigns and demonstrated the impact of these policies. And what we really found is that, again, building connections between different communities has really been the key to our success in these campaigns. Thanks, Sheila.
Thank you so much, Sushma, for painting the picture of how Unite Oregon was built post 9/11 and really the story arc of how Unite Oregon is now advocating on so many issues that stem from a lot of the expanded surveillance and policing practices from the post 9/11 era. And I think hearing about your founder's now role as a public servant in the state Senate is really exciting. I see Amaha snapping and Homaira smiling as well. Well, moving on now, Homaira, you know, we all now have seen the impact of US policy in Afghanistan over the past 20 years, especially with the current urgent situation. And I know that your family's roots are in Afghanistan. So can you share with us your reflections on the US policy in Afghanistan and its impact on refugees, including the current refugee crisis, as well as a little bit about how PANA, your organization, is now fighting for all refugee communities in the San Diego area?
Of course, thank you so much for having me and for that question. I am getting over a cold, so my voice is a little bit off. But yeah, I mean, to address the question, the situation in Afghanistan is, I think, terrifying to say the least. Just this week, the World Food Program stated that there's about 22.8 million people who are facing acute food insecurity, and that many of these are children. And, you know, they are on that path to starvation if nothing is done. And as an Afghan American who still has family in Afghanistan, I can't even begin to talk about how that feels like, you know, to know that that's what the current situation is and what's going to happen in the weeks and months to come if, you know, nothing happens, I guess, from the international community. You know, many individuals like myself and my family have been applying for humanitarian parole for our families and have just basically faced roadblock, dead end from USCIS, who's basically, after the first few weeks, not really processing applications at the current time, saying they're doing as fast as they can, but we haven't seen many go through. So it's just the current situation. I can't even describe what that is currently like for those in Afghanistan, but also for the diaspora community throughout the world who is watching what's happening. The United States interest in Afghanistan, to me, has always been one-sided, from fighting the Cold War, utilizing Afghan lives, and then waging the global war on terror as part of their 9/11 response. The United States opted to wage this unwinnable war at a cost of over $2 trillion and hundreds of thousands of lives lost, and the vast majorities of these being Afghan lives. Over the past 20 years, we've witnessed multiple administrations literally ignoring international law and our Constitution and betraying our humanity. This includes the Guantanamo Bay, that occurred with hundreds of Afghans being caught in that, but also prisons in Afghanistan. When the United States military left Afghanistan, there were still 5,000 prisoners in the infamous Bagram prison that were basically trapped and then escaped. But despite all of that, we are still seeing that when the Biden administration decided to take the troops out, he made a very public commitment that they will continue to use drones in Afghanistan. And in the weeks of chaos of evacuating thousands of vulnerable Afghans, we saw that the administration really did follow through on that and killed 10 innocent civilians, including 7 children. So the policies that have been used in Afghanistan have just been one of mass destruction, have been one that have prioritized, industry rather than the lives of people. And during this unprecedented time now that we're facing, the United States did make this, attempt to evacuate over 100,000 people. And many of them, excuse me, are not even considered refugees currently. They are humanitarian parolees because of the process in which they arrived into the United States. It's really, really important during this time that we recognize that the United States has a responsibility towards these people. We have a responsibility towards ensuring the successful resettlement of this population, and that a lot needs to be done in order to ensure that local communities like ours have the ability to provide humanitarian response to the Afghan refugees coming here now into the United States, but also towards the millions of Afghans who are in Afghanistan who are now facing not only starvation, but just the terrible rule under the Taliban. And in terms of PANA in cities like San Diego, we are looking at what our local response needs to be. We're working with our coalition partners to build a rapid response infrastructure to support and welcome refugees by ensuring that they are connected to the Afghan community and that they have access to resources. At PANA, we hear time and time again, we have not only started working with the refugee community now, this is what we were initially started out as an organization to do, to assess and to advocate for the needs of the refugee community. And what we hear time and time again from our communities is that housing is one of their largest barriers, access to safe, affordable housing. So with the incoming refugees, we are starting a fund, but we're also advocating for policies at the local, state, and federal level that increase access to safe, affordable housing for refugees. We're providing legal assistance as well to refugee families as they learn to navigate our complex legal system. As I mentioned, the vast majority of individuals who were evacuated during this crisis are humanitarian parolees, and unless Congress acts to create a blanket adjustment status for all of the humanitarian parolees, they will actually need legal support to adjust their status within the next 2 years, because that's how long their parole status currently is. Nationally, we're part of coalitions that engage in conversations to advocate for safe, humane, and dignified resettlement. I find myself on multiple calls with so many different agencies, including the DHS, DOD, ORR, and others, advocating for the needs of Afghans at the bases, at the military bases throughout the country, at the unaccompanied shelters, and in localities throughout the country. Even, you know, there's just so many multiple areas, I think, where within Operations Ally Welcome that there needs to be the issues that need to be addressed. And I think that one of the things I've been finding most concerning is that even though these Afghans were literally coming here, fleeing for their lives en masse and brought here by the United States government, there's still this suspicion of who they are. Right. This is clearly evident by the fact that the Department of Defense and the Department of Homeland Security is overseeing this entire population. Generally, refugee resettlement happens through ORR, and they're not overseeing this. They're one of the agencies involved, but this is really housed under DOD and DHS. Yet, you know, and these individuals who are coming are not spending 1 or 2 days at these military bases. They're spending, you know, months now, and are slowly coming in and integrating into our communities, and are facing really harsh conditions at the military bases. Yet still we have these calls like the governor of Montana saying that we need to halt refugee resettlement into our communities until these folks are fully vetted. And so I think that what this means for you know, the responsibility that the United States has at this current time, but also where the tides churn really fast is a huge concern for me and many of us who are working on this issue. We also saw this in terms of the funding that was allocated. We were really happy to see in the continuing resolution that was passed a few weeks ago that $6.4 billion went towards the refugee resettlement process of these Afghans. However, billions went to DOD, DHS, CBP for these efforts. In addition to that, there was money allocated to go towards refugee resettlement agencies to provide parolees many of the same benefits as refugees. However, I cannot stress enough that this is not enough. Refugee resettlement in this country is currently 30 to 90 days of support. These families came with nothing. They have nothing. They don't have the infrastructure. And to expect them to be able to resettle and rebuild their lives with 30 to 90 days support. And in places like San Diego that is facing a huge housing crisis, they won't barely even last 30 days. That is not enough. And as PANA, we continue to urge for humane and just resettlement that actually looks at the longer term needs of our refugee communities. We were founded by refugees, we are led by refugees, and we are held accountable to our community. So we continue to work on this issue, but we continue to work on many of the issues that Sushma, I believe, also mentioned in terms of, you know, tackling the surveillance infrastructure that target and criminalize our communities. We also work on power building, you know, the long-term issues, making sure that our communities are stronger together. This year, we are heavily engaged in the redistricting process. We want to make sure that the lines that are drawn, not only at the city level, but the county level and the state level, actually keep our BAMEMSA communities together so that we have a stronger voting bloc and stronger voting power. And in the year to come, we continue to work on political education and continue to work on our civic engagement programs to ensure that our communities are engaged in the civic engagement process. Overall, we'll continue to push for policies that advance not only the immediate needs of our communities, but really the power building that needs to continue so that our communities are thriving rather than just surviving. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Homaira, for that really rich description of how our policy has long been so troubling with respect to Afghanistan and PANA's incredible work. A couple things that you noted that really stood out to me are just how our policy prioritizes business instead of human lives. I think there's some real room for transformation there at all levels of government, certainly at the federal level. And then, you know, what you shared about the tremendous gulf between how much funding goes to refugee resettlement versus how much is still going to DOD and the government apparatuses that have really harmed all of our communities. Thank you so much. And you could probably give a presentation just on PANA's incredible work to empower refugee communities. So those of you who aren't familiar with PANA or any of our grantees, I definitely recommend that you check out the incredible power building work that they're all doing. Now, Amaha, moving to you, I'm really excited to hear from you about how African communities together responded to the Muslim and African bans of the last administration. And from your organization's vantage point, how do those policies connect back to post-9/11 policies?
Thanks, Sheila. Thanks also Sushma and Homaira. Learned a lot about, you know, I've been immersed in this for years now, and I still learn the most by hearing leaders on the front lines like you. Happy to be having this conversation, and I'll just say a word of introduction about ACT first, African Communities Together. We are an organization of and for immigrants from Africa and their families. We launched in New York in 2012, expanded to DC, Maryland, Virginia in 2015. Currently in the process of expansion to Philadelphia, which we're very excited about. And then we work nationally with a network of African immigrant leaders and institutions, and also with national committees of beneficiaries of specific immigration policies, like Sudanese with temporary protected status, or Liberians who benefit from the Liberian Refugee Immigration Fairness Program, and DED, Deferred Enforced Departure prior to that. And our model, you know, integrates, similar to some of what Sushma was describing, integrates direct service. People come to us often because they're looking for help with immigration legal services, or they're trying to get a job. And we try to help our communities meet those immediate survival needs, but then bring them into the organization, you know, and help them move along a ladder of engagement where they go from being service recipients and clients to being members, coming to their first membership meeting, and eventually as leaders in campaigns, which we have local, state, and federal policy campaigns that we have fought and won over the last several years. And then some have moved on to even, you know, larger advocacy roles, you know, coming on staff or becoming national spokespeople, testifying before Congress and so forth. So that's our model, and that's what we do. And as you can imagine, you know, as an organization working with immigrants from sub-Saharan Africa, we've been in the thick of a lot of these issues since our founding. And it's always challenging to talk about these, you know, sort of have these historical conversations, because it's so important to recognize that there was a shift, you know, on September 11, 2001, and that we did enter kind of a new era. And we also have to recognize that the policies of surveillance, repression, and exclusion did not begin on September 11, 2001, did not begin under the, the Bush administration, and have in many ways been around throughout the history of the United States, and persisted, long across, with Democratic majorities, Republican majorities, Democrats in the White House, Republicans in the White House. These policies of repression, exclusion, and surveillance have been a through line, a continuous thread. And I think it's so important when we talk about those policies to do what Sheila did and what we're doing here with this policy, to name Islamophobia as a guiding and driving force in US foreign policy and domestic policy, including immigration policy, and to name anti-Blackness and specifically anti-African rhetoric, the rhetoric tied to the idea of the backwardness or the tribalism of Africa and of Africans as driving forces in policy. And I don't think we can understand the sustained assault on African immigrants, the African diaspora, on Black people without having that dimension, because it's been an assault against Africans who are Muslim, who are Christian, and who hold traditional religious beliefs as well. And so it's really important for us to have that framework, not just when we have conversations like this, but for how they shape our analysis of the problems and the policies that we advocate for. At times, I think the post 9/11 development of a framework that explicitly names Islamophobia has been important and salutary and really necessary. But at times, Muslim organizations that are not Black-led have sometimes used that framework in a way that erases differing experiences or have ignored specific policy issues that have targeted Africans disproportionately. And it's a problem and a shame, because a lot of the policies, even immediately post 9/11, were intersectional. Were targeted people at the intersection of their African and Black identities and their Muslim identities. So the ways that both federal law enforcement and the NYPD targeted mosques in New York City post 9/11. Many of them were Arab, had predominantly Arab worshipers. Many had predominantly South Asian worshipers. Many of them were African. Every West African mosque goer has a story about that person who they all knew was a mole, was infiltrating the congregation, and and then horror stories of kind of repression and surveillance, the experiences of African women on the street or on the subway having their hijab pulled from their head. And then, we saw some of these anti-Black, anti-African demonstrations even, manifesting during the Obama administration, during the Ebola pandemic, and the ways that everyone from some of our smallest kids were experiencing acts of hate, acts of harassment. And so when we entered the Trump era and, sort of a new kind of crescendo of being targeted and harassed and having draconian policies enforced against our communities, it was familiar in many ways to us, and we, I think if there's a silver lining, it's that we had some time to prepare. Of course, Trump took it to another level, right? Even before he was elected, he flew to Minnesota and made a speech that was all about how Minnesotans were being invaded by refugees, specifically Somali refugees, and how they should have the ability to reject and exclude refugees. It continued, of course, with the infamous comments about shithole countries, which many of us recognize as really the language of ethnic cleansing, comparing our communities and our people and our countries of origin, you know, to filth. That is the language of ethnic cleansing. And this intersection of anti-African and anti-Muslim you know, narratives and policies, we really saw in the first Muslim ban. It's important to really underscore that half of the countries targeted by the first Muslim ban, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, are African countries. And then, you know, as if to kind of underscore all of this, there was, in the last year of the Trump administration in 2020, you know, we saw a policy that targeted more than ever before immigrants from Africa, and that's what we sort of referred to as the Africa ban, specifically because it targeted Nigeria, the largest country on the continent, Eritrea, Sudan, and Tanzania. And we saw in that moment a lot of groups that were, you know, sort of not Rise Together, you know, or Proteus, really struggling with the language of what to even refer to this, and just being hesitant to call it an African ban in the same way that we had referred to, you know, the first ban in 2017 as a Muslim ban. And we think that that's, you know, that was, it was a fight for visibility that was really important to undertake. And that carried through throughout the 2020 election and the transition. Biden had made a very public commitment that he would, quote unquote, reverse the Muslim ban on his first day in office. That language didn't make clear whether that by Muslim ban, he was also including the 2020 African ban. And our take was that they were of a piece with each other. And that they all needed to be reversed and repealed, as well as moving legislation like the No Ban Act that would make it harder for future administrations to target people based on race, religion, and just a sense that, you know, the preference for immigrants from Northern Europe that like Trump had explicitly articulated. So we, along with other Black immigrant groups, we worked particularly closely with the Undocumented Black Network. We really were advocating with the transition team right up until inauguration day to make sure that the repeal of the African ban was included in those day one actions. And thankfully it was, thanks to that advocacy, as well as our other day one priority, which was extending deferred enforced departure for Liberia. And really, but that really took organizing and advocacy that explicitly named our community's needs and issues, and didn't sort of, you know, allow them to be eclipsed or submerged under a larger umbrella. I think the last thing that I just want to refer to briefly, and I think this came up when in both Sushma's and Homaira's comments, which is the focus on post 9/11 policies has heavily been on the enforcement side. You know, when we think about what has you know, what has gone wrong and what we need to fight, and that's important, right? The creation of DHS and ICE was a disaster for our communities. NCERS was a disaster for our communities. Runaway enforcement actions were disasters for our communities. But really, there has been a kind of seamless fabric of policies that include enforcement, that include detention, that include locking people up at the border, but that are also about pathways to legal immigration, right? We talked about refugee resettlement and how we saw it go from 100,000 and plummet to 15,000 under the Trump administration, gutting many refugee resettlement agencies and you know, gutting the infrastructure for humanitarian immigration. You know, the Biden administration has pledged to get that back up to 125,000, which is great, but it's actually still just a fraction of really the US shouldering its global burden. You know, if we resettled 1 1/10 of 1% of the US population as refugees every year, that would be 350,000 refugee resettlements. And we think that that's kind of the level that we should be aiming for. We fought against the gutting of the diversity visa program, which allows 55,000 immigrants every year to migrate legally. The Trump administration instituted a rule called the passport rule, which basically requires everyone before even just to be considered to provide a passport from their country of origin, which is often very difficult for people in developing countries. That sometimes there are chronic passport shortages. Sometimes a government won't allow you to procure a passport unless you have a travel booked. One result of that policy, applications to the diversity visa program went from 14 million to 6 million, and most of the worldwide, and most of that decline happened in Africa. So these policies, the exclusion, the anti-immigrant forces are looking across the breadth of policies from enforcement to asylum to refugee resettlement to gumming up the works of applying for routine family visas. And they know that the stakes for them are controlling who is allowed to be a citizen of the United States and ensuring that that is limited to a certain vision based on race, religion, and country of origin. And we should have a similarly broad and inclusive vision as we fight against these policies.
Thank you so much, Amaha, for really painting the picture for us of kind of the before 9/11 problematic policy, and then of course bringing us to present day, the language that was used around shithole countries and the ethnic cleansing implied by that language. Thank you also for pointing out, within Muslim communities and impacted communities, the inability to understand how to address a new iteration of the ban that is targeting very clearly African countries. And the current president's commitment to rescinding the Muslim ban, not specifying the African ban, I think demonstrates work that we have to do in our advocacy strategies at the national level as well. Really, really incredible work that you all are doing, and the perspective, Amaha, that you bring as founder of the organization is just really incredible. I want to now shift over to a few questions for our panelists, first beginning with Sushma, going back to you. So we've talked a lot about the effects of post 9/11 policy and continued work that all of you are doing in power building and addressing current threats simultaneously. So, and Amaha really began leading us into this topic, but when we talk about the need for solidarity across refugee and immigrant communities in the United States, especially since our communities are still stuck in that securitized war on terror framework, do you feel that solidarity in the refugee and immigrant space is growing, and how can we foster that even further? So Sushma, I'll start with you on that question.
Thanks, Sheila, and Amaha, Myra, it was really great to hear your remarks. So at Unite Oregon, I did talk a little bit about our leadership development cohorts, and these are spaces that end up being really diverse, and sometimes we have between 15 to 20 different countries of origin, or 15 to 20 languages represented in one like sort of 30-person cohort. Which has really been amazing. And some of the early workshops that we really emphasize are workshops around wedge issues, like who benefits from tearing us apart, and why do those wedge issues exist? And another one we do, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, is River of Life, where we sort of really like dig deep and talk about like the experiences in our lives that brought us here bring us here today in the work that we're doing or applying for this cohort, leadership development cohort. So I think really those storytelling, it's about storytelling, right? It's about like talking about the struggles that we actually do have in common as immigrants and refugees and people of color in this country. I think when you create spaces for solidarity like that, then you do find that the solidarity is naturally there. So that's the first thing I want to say. The second thing is, I think there are some positive trends and negative trends. The positive is, I think during the Trump administration, we really were all slammed together and we had to grow solidarity out of an emergency situation. So I think we grew a lot of solidarity during the Trump administration emergency time. Most recently, I think we saw a lot of solidarity across cultures during the Haitian asylum crisis, right? We saw a lot of people step up and say, these asylees are being treated differently because they're Black, And then with the Afghan crisis, there were a lot of Vietnamese refugee community members that stood up and said, look, like, this is what happened to us. And we have to create room. Like a lot of the work that Humaira is talking about, I think a lot of Vietnamese family and community members stepped up and tried to put light on the situation. So I think those are some positive trends. Something that we're dealing with in Unite Oregon is anti-Blackness in immigrant communities. It's really, really deep and hard issue to work on with other communities of color. And we're trying to figure that out in our sort of multiracial spaces, like why we need to center Black lives, why we need to center Black voices. And that has been a hard and difficult conversation in our organization.
Thank you so much for naming that and the persistent anti-Black racism that I think we're all figuring out how we can best root out and ensure that all of our communities have a shared understanding of who benefits from tearing us apart, like you said, Sushma. Humaira, I would love to hear from you about the solidarity aspect and from Panna's vantage point, how can we foster stronger solidarity across refugee and immigrant communities?
So at Panna, we work with a diverse refugee population, right? And one of the most interesting things that I found when I first joined the organization 2+ years ago, we had a steering committee that was being simultaneously translated into 4 different languages. So we had the Syrian community newcomers who were, speaking Arabic. We had Somali, we had Swahili, and then we had English. So all 4 were, and I think one of the things that was so interesting is like we really utilized that as a space to build bridges amongst these communities and to kind of like the political education that needs to happen to find what are the commonalities within our struggles. And I think that those kinds of places are so important in terms of being able to build solidarity within the most affected communities, right? And I think it really happens at that community level, at that level of like sharing bread together, right? And being able to build community together. I think that on a more like macro level nationally, from where we were a decade ago to now having spaces like Rise Together, where we can come together to really address the issues that we're facing has been key in terms of Afghanistan and the work that has been happening, really rapid response. I've been really motivated by seeing so many folks stepping up. I think that there do need to be some kind of like narrative shifts and broader messaging that we need to really focus on as to like how do we bring together these various struggles. So like from the humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan to the refugees to the Haitian asylees to the broader immigrant rights movement and the call for citizenship. I think that there needs to be, I think there are forces that want to really separate those things and be like, well, we only care about one or the other. Or how come these Afghans are getting special treatment while other people are being deported, right? And I've seen some of those kinds of conversations that are so disheartening to me, because I'm like, the goal needs to be the same as Maha stated. I mean, we need to increase refugee resettlement in this country. We are not doing our due share at all, and we are creating more and more refugees throughout the world because of our imperialistic infrastructure that we have in this country, right? And more needs to happen, and we need to really focus on how do we build those narratives, how do we build those stronger narratives across all of these varying issues, because otherwise, like I mentioned before, I'm really worried about the tides shifting again on refugee resettlement, where we're going to have a closed door policy like the Trump administration, right? And how do we build those strong enough movements where the broader public understands that this is our moral obligation?
Thank you, Homaira, for sharing that. And I know that your founder and executive director is a Somali refugee, and you joined her team. Really, I think out of your shared experience and the organizing you're doing is really incredible. Just want to remind folks to please add your questions in the chat as we continue hearing from our panelists. We look forward to your questions. So please don't be shy. You can use the chat or the Q&A function in Zoom. And Amaha, going to you again about this solidarity topic, we would love to hear from you, as well as the specific strategy that African Communities Together is involved with that reflects a multiracial solidarity approach.
I think as Homaira and Sushma have underlined, it's important to build multiracial solidarity, to recognize the kind of the narratives and the ideologies that have kind of torn us apart and pitted us against each other, in the hierarchy of American racism, and recognize that ultimately, we can't climb over those barriers. We can only team up to tear them down together. I think it's also one important contribution to that, I think, is for each of us to be doing really deep-rooted, culturally appropriate work to empower different communities, right? And so whether it's, Pana doing, interpretation in 4 different languages for their, for their meetings, or, us, sort of really trying to build deep relationships with, West African communities in New York or East African communities in Northern Virginia. I think the first place where we start with building multiracial solidarity is base building within the different communities, because we can't really come to the table as equals and build together if there are massive, imbalances in sort of how we're organized and how we're able to participate. So I think one thing that we've done to try to build, try to go from there to building bridges and connections and organic ties to other communities. Some of this has happened in our work to save and protect temporary protected status, and the hundreds of thousands of TPS holders. ACT has been involved with that work really since 2014, when TPS was approved for Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone, and we felt that there's a set of issues affecting those countries as well as other African countries like Sudan and Somalia, where it was really important that we represent what were sometimes, TPS communities that didn't get as much attention. So we joined onto the national lawsuit, Ramos v. Nielsen, that helped stop the Trump administration's attempts to end that program. And because Sudan was actually the first country facing termination, we were sort of the first domino. So it was really important that we were able to find directly affected TPS Sudanese TPS holders to join as plaintiffs and to join as a institutional plaintiff ourselves. We ultimately ended up in the course of that work, building a new shared table where the TPS, the organizations of TPS countries that were not Central American and so didn't operate in a shared language of Spanish and sort of shared geography, could advocate specifically for our issues together and build capacity together. It was really important for us to do because there was phenomenal organizing happening amongst Central American communities with groups like Alianza Americas or and National TPS Alliance, but we really needed a place where we could come together and make sure that our work was as impactful. So we ended up forming alliance with Undocumented Black Network, which worked with both African and Haitian TPS holders, and AdhiCARRP, which is an incredible Nepali community organizing group that many of you probably know, in primary, headquartered in Queens, New York. And then ultimately that alliance grew to include Haitian Bridge Alliance, who many of you know for really leading against the horrific raids and roundups and deportation flights at the border, and the Biden administration still clinging on to this racist Title 42 policy passed by the Trump administration. And also National Network for Arab American Communities. So our 5 organizations, Arab, South Asian, African, Afro-Caribbean, Afro-Latinx, we sort of created a new table that was sort of a space of inclusivity where we could then participate in larger kind of alliances and campaigns. And that cross-cultural work that Sushma referred to, the River of Life exercises, and starting to understand our shared histories and our shared journeys, has been, I think, for me, one of the most rewarding parts of helping create that space.
Uh-oh, Sheila might be frozen.
Yeah, it looks like Sheila's feed is frozen temporarily.
Yeah, I don't see any of the questions that have come in here on the chat, but maybe if we wanted to expand a little further just on this question, and we'll get Sheila back here.
Great. Yeah, I think we don't have an ability to take questions live. So if you have a question, I think if you can put it in the Q&A or chat at the bottom of your screen, we can try to get to those. But Homaira and Sushma, more thoughts about multiracial alliance building and solidarity? I would be happy to spend the rest of our time talking about that.
I just really appreciated hearing from both of you. I think there's so much that needs to be done, right? I think in terms of just at the community level, I think I heard that from all 3 of us, is like that's really where the work happens, is at the community level, and making sure that we're understanding those things and building upon them. I think having cultural competent, and this is something that in so much of the advocacy I'm doing around refugee resettlement is really difficult, is how do we build out that work from a culturally competent, from the folks who are actually facing those issues as well. I think in the resettlement spaces, it's very, very white driven, very much not talking about the multiracial work that needs to happen, and is something that I think I'm realizing is not even in the radar, right? And so I've been really trying to struggle or like think through how do we continue to build out those spaces, because so much of it is from like the service provider side rather than like advocacy as it relates to refugee resettlement.
Thanks. Thanks y'all for your insight. And we have a couple of questions here coming in. So from Jackie, this is how do you gather feedback and action steps from clients in the communities that you're serving? So if anybody wants to jump in here, and then we have a question that will wrap up here. And I think Sheila's coming back.
Awesome. I mean, I can start first with us. So at PANA, we not only do we have steering committees in multiple different languages, but every 2 years, we also embark on this like large study that we do where we interview over 500 refugee communities in San Diego County about various issues that they're facing. And so this is everything from education, jobs, housing, and from that we create a report and we develop our policy priorities based on the feedback that we get from our community. And then after that, there's multiple community conversations going into what does this look like? Are our priorities on track right now as an organization? What are the other issues that the community is facing that we should be tackling? And so I think that kind of really holistic process that's really ingrained in the organization. We really do the full process every 2 years. It helps inform our work on a granular level, but also in terms of like advocacy, and it's on our website. So if folks want to read our last one that just came out earlier this year, I would definitely, I'll put it in the chat for folks, but that's one of the ways that we have like a feedback loop.
Wonderful. I hope you all can hear me. I'm so sorry. My Wi-Fi cut out, but I'm back on my cell phone, and great to hear some questions from the audience as well. And just as we're approaching the end of our session, I would love to hear from each panelist. Sushma, starting with you, what is your vision for the future? What is the world you hope we can achieve for the communities your organization serves and for all immigrant communities?
Thanks, Sheila. First of all, Homara, I'm so looking forward to reading that survey. It sounds really cool. Our vision, I mean, broadly, Sheila, our vision at Unite Oregon is racial justice. And I guess that means something to everybody else, something different to everybody, but really like that investments and decision-making center the most impacted people. And they have an equal voice to make decisions. And I think that's like something that that's why I'm really excited about our service to organizing model that I mentioned earlier, and wanting to build that out more. It really came out of like mutual aid that we embarked upon for the first time during we had really devastating wildfires in Southern Oregon in the summer of 2020. And there was a need for that. We had never really done anything like that, but we were like organizing suitcases, and we had just like a bunch of food in a parking lot. And it was hard, but also we found that if we aren't in those spaces, there are white nationalists and Nazis that are setting up checkpoints in rural Oregon, barring people that didn't look like them from entering certain areas of rural Oregon. So I think, what am I trying to say is that I guess like we found that if we aren't in the spaces like sort of direct service and mutual aid spaces, other people are going to be there, and the advantage of doing this is once people are stable and served, maybe they will start to question, with political education, why was there mutual aid needed in the first place? Like why aren't these services being provided? So that's sort of something like I'm looking forward to for Unite Oregon in particular, to build out a little bit more so we can get closer to that hopeful future.
Wonderful, thank you. And Homaira, moving to you, how would you articulate your vision for the future, and what is it? What's the world that you're hoping to build for all refugees and immigrants?
We want liberation for our people. For PANA, we envision a world where refugees are connected global leaders building transcontinental movement work to advance meaningful freedom for all. That's our vision. It's very intentional and articulated. Not only are we looking at refugees in San Diego, in America, but we're looking at a global movement for how refugees are, how they are able to rebuild their lives wherever they are. Only 1% of refugees are actually ever, resettled. So what happens to the 99 other percent, right? And how do we build a world where hopefully we don't need refugees, right? With that there's all of that. But for us, it's continuing to work towards that path to liberation. I just keep it short there.
Thank you so much. And Amaha, to close us out, we would love to hear your vision for the future. You've already shared one refugee resettlement goal of maybe 350,000 for this country, but what else would you share with us in terms of how we can chart a better future for refugees and immigrants?
Well, I think one piece of the big vision that I think we all have to, build together, right? For me, it's so much of our immigration policy right now requires immigrants to be extraordinary, right? Like they either have to demonstrate extraordinary merit, by being dreamers, by being, PhDs, and in this way that sort of contrasts them with undeserving immigrants, undeserving native-born African Americans, most usually, or to demonstrate extraordinary hardship, right? Not just the ordinary hardship of poverty and violence, but really something special, something more that entitles them to a shot at migrating. And one of the things, I sort of articulated this in a recent, in a chapter in a recent book about the future of the immigrant rights movement that I'll drop the link in the chat. One thing I think we need to do a better job lifting up is the idea that migration is ordinary, that the forces that drive people to migrate are ordinary, that they are, simply wanting to be safer, wanting to be freer, wanting to be with the people that we love, wanting to have more opportunity and a better life for our families, and that those are normal and natural, and that we don't bear the burden of justifying them, that really states that want to enjoy, the benefits of the international flows of workers and capital and, entertainment and, culture, but cut off the free movement of people who just want to follow those ordinary urges and flows. They should be the ones who have to justify why they're right and we're wrong. And so for me, a system of both US policy and international law that recognizes that reality, that recognizes that we have been migrating as a species since we first existed as a species, and it's made us who we are. To me, that is one part of what a just future looks like.
Thank you so much, Amaha, and to all of our panelists, Homaira and Sushma. This was truly a special conversation, and we're so thrilled that we were able to share this with all of you today. I just want to remind all of you that this was the kickoff for the National Immigrant Integration Conference virtual series. You'll be getting weekly communications from NIC organizers with upcoming sessions. Please do also note the resources our panelists posted in the chat. Amaha just posted the book Immigration Matters. Homaira had posted their refugee experiences report. So please do make use of those. And thank you, participants and those viewing on Facebook Live. We encourage you to follow the work of our speakers on social media. And please keep up the wonderful work. Thank you again, Amaha, Sushma, and Homaira.
Thank you.